Good evening, I'm Barry Feinstein, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. It's great to have you all with us here tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program on foreign affairs with Aluf Benn and Jeffrey Goldberg, the second in the three-part series of the Manovill Conversations, reporting Israel, the personal, the political, and the press. Through the generosity of the Laszlo N. Tauber Family Foundation, and in blessed memory of Ingrid Tauber's late grandfather, Alfred Manovill, the JCCSF has had the privilege of presenting some really extraordinary programs over the past few years, including last year's program, Loaded Jews and Money, as well as conversations with Nicholas Christoph, Leon Wieseltier, Saul Friedlander, and Rabbi David Weiss-Halivni. Please join me in showing your appreciation to the family. Thank you. We are extremely excited this year to present these conversations in partnership with Haaretz, Israel's oldest and most distinguished progressive daily newspaper, and arguably one of its most important institutions. Owned and run by the Shokin family since 1935, Haaretz has no competition when it comes to the important role it plays on the national stage in Israel. It is not afraid to ask tough questions and sometimes deal with uncomfortable and controversial issues. This has made it the frequent target of those who seek to silence critical voices coming from within Israel itself. We started this series in December with Ari Shavit and David Remnick, and continue tonight with Aluf and Jeffrey, and we'll end in April with a conversation on whistleblowers with investigative reporters Uri Blau and Barton Gelman. In addition to framing the series around the most pressing issues facing the State of Israel, we are also looking at the subject of Haaretz itself as a symbol of liberalism and freedom of the press within Israel and the diaspora. I'd like to acknowledge our partners for tonight's program. We're proud to partner with each and every one of them: the Israel Center of the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, the Consul General of Israel to the Pacific and Northwest, and finally, thanks go to our community partners for their support: Congregation Emmanuel, the Contemporary Jewish Museum, the Creative Writing Department at San Francisco State University, the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and last but not least, the New Israel Fund. And now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's guests. Aluf Benn is the editor-in-chief of Haaretz. He has followed the country's leadership, foreign policy, and national security, covering 6 prime ministers from the late Yitzhak Rabin through Bibi Netanyahu's second term, and reporting on Arab-Israeli wars and peace efforts since the Oslo Accords in 1993. Aluf's work has appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and Newsweek, and he's a regular contributor to the Guardian newspaper. Jeffrey Goldberg has been on our stage before and is a Bloomberg View columnist. He began his career at the Washington Post, later wrote a column for the Jerusalem Post, and wrote for the New York Times Magazine. He is the author of Prisoners, A Story of Friendship and Terror, a former national correspondent for The Atlantic, and a Washington and Middle East correspondent for The New Yorker. Jeffrey Goldberg has been public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a fellow at the Jerusalem Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Aluf and Jeffrey to the JCCSF stage.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. Thanks for coming. So what we're going to do is, what are we going to do? We're going to have a conversation for a good period of time, and then because this is I'm guessing it's a mostly Jewish audience, we're not going to have Q&A. We're going to go right to corrections. I'm kidding. I really am kidding. We are going to have a lot of time to be directed by your questions and your interests. We have a tremendous number of topics to discuss, obviously. whenever I come out here, the first topic I always want to discuss is the history and future of Scottish Jewry. I just totally fascinated, and all of Scottish Jewry is apparently here. Was just here on the stage. But we'll talk about the Middle East also. But so let me start.
You're talking about independent Scotland, the two-state solution.
The two-state solution,
right.
I think we all support Scottish independence, but splitting Edinburgh doesn't seem to to building a wall or something. I want to start, and we're just going to have this back and forth for a while. But I want to start, if you can sort of. You've just been in Israel. You got here. You got to the States earlier this week. It seems as if we are at an inflection point in a number of very, very important, even existential issues. The two that obviously rise to the top perennially, it seems, are the question of Iran and the nuclear threat, and then this is a bit of a surprise, the sort of revitalized peace process, revitalized by, it seems like, a single man, the Secretary of State. It seems as if the now, I think you can use the expression, longtime Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is kind of in an unusual position. He's being jammed in every direction. He's very powerful at home. Politically, there's no obvious successor as prime minister. But he seems to be coming to a moment when he's going to have to make some very tough decisions about the direction his country is going in. And it's against the backdrop of a disintegrating Middle East. Everywhere he looks, everywhere you look as editor of Haaretz, when you look beyond Israel's borders, you see chaos. So just take a couple of minutes and sort of frame out where Israel is, where the politics of these two main situations is. And then one of the things I want to do tonight is have sort of broaden out the discussion from the usual topics and talk a little bit about American Jewry and its relationship with Israel, because that's become obviously not only because of BDS and everything else, but it's become a topic that goes past politics in a way and goes to the sort of the nature of American Jewry and who we are and who we are becoming. But let's start on the Middle East and take it away.
You know, in the past year, more or less, we went through 4 surprises. 4 major changes in all these important topics. The first one, they're not necessarily by order of importance or chronologically, but the first one was the American Iranian détente. That now we know began in secret even before the presidential election there, and obviously gained higher pace after the rise of Rouhani to the presidency of Iran. And obviously, this was bad news to Netanyahu and to the Israeli government, but it's still been going on. They just concluded the first round of final status talks with the Iranians in Vienna. And the last I heard from there is that they're very optimistic of some kind of deal reached. And clearly that changes the entire geopolitical structure of the Middle East, with the US all of a sudden siding with the Shiites in their fight against the Sunnis. And that puts Israel on the side of Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies against that tide. The second surprise was the change of heart in the American policy towards Syria. With the massacre there still going on, President Obama changed his heart and joined Netanyahu in assessing that Assad is still the lesser evil. That if Assad is gone, we're going to get first more chaos, and out of that chaos there might rise the Sunni Republic of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And therefore, Obama made this deal with Assad of, stay in power and give away chemical weapons. By the way, a windfall for Israel. These chemical weapons were the tip of the Syrian arsenal as far as we were concerned. And the Israeli government decided to stop distributing gas masks. And Israel needed to give nothing in return. There was no Israeli quid pro quo. The third surprise, which I believe is far more debated here, is the rise of the BDS movement. And the threat of sanctions against Israel that was, in the far fringe of the discussion only a year ago, is now the center of discussion. Even among Israeli politicians, those who support the Kerry peace plan, supported with the argument that if we don't go there, we're going to face boycott. And two events really changed the dialogue on this. One was the European decision to precondition any cooperation agreement with Israel on the money not going to the settlements. And the other, not related to Israel per se, was the death of Nelson Mandela that gave, that gave a lot of energy to those who argue that Israel is the present-day apartheid. But Israeli politicians and Israeli public opinion, for the first time, had to contend with the issue that we might be separated from the West and become a pariah. Now, the actual effect of the BDS on Israel is minimal, is mainly symbolic.
I mean, Israel's economy is stronger than the American economy right now. It's fair to say.
In relative terms, but not only that. Even when we talk about microeconomics of this. So we had this Dutch pension fund boycotting Israeli banks, but at the same time we had a Japanese company buying an Israeli software company for $900 million, and Google buying another Israeli startup for an undisclosed sum of money. And we had Scarlett Johansson leaving Oxfam and siding with SodaStream. But
the new Queen Esther of the Jews.
Yeah. But then again, it's a surprise because it wasn't expected that the issue of boycott and sanctions would be so central to the debate within and about Israel. And last but very much not least, as you mentioned, is the Kerry mission. If you recall, when Obama put together his second administration team, the main name that came to the fore, as far as Israel was concerned, was Chuck Hagel. And there were all these issues about Hagel and the Israel lobby and so on. Hagel today is a very good friend of Israel. We hear nothing from him. But Kerry came basically from retirement or semi-retirement to launch a peace process like, we haven't seen that kind of energy and involvement from an American leader since Camp David, since Bill Clinton. And that was at the end of his administration, and now it's the beginning. Now, none of us knows to what extent the president is standing behind Kerry and actually pushing him, or is it the kind of play in which if Kerry wins and makes peace and brokers peace, then Obama justifies his own Nobel Prize. And if Kerry fails, it's Kerry and not Obama. We don't know, but everybody in Israel and not least the Israeli government was surprised by the energy, determination, and what our defense minister called the messianic obsession of Kerry in dealing with the issue.
Well, let me ask you about this. I want to come to BDS in a second, but let me ask you about Kerry. You're right, there's a lot of energy on the one hand. On the other hand, you're dealing with certain immutable facts. One is that Israeli governing coalition is a right-wing coalition. Fact number two, the Palestinian entity, the territory that would become the state of Palestine is actually divided between two warring factions, semi-warring factions, Fatah in the West Bank, Hamas in Gaza. So they're not even, the negotiators, who are relatively weak already, aren't even negotiating on behalf of the entirety of what would be the Palestinian polity. And then you have to deal with the fact that we're no closer. I mean, everybody, there's no secrets here. No one is confused about what an ideal final status would look like, but we don't seem any closer on the part of both populations to getting there. So are we just sort of making believe once again that we have a forward-moving process?
Where I come from, being a pessimist has proved itself since biblical times, since the prophets. Being a pessimist got you into the Bible. Being an optimist got you into the sidelines and oblivion. So it's always easy to say nothing will come out of it. And clearly the odds are against.
I'm not asking you to be in the Bible. I'm just asking for your analysis.
My analysis, look, the odds are still against it. And the odds are against it for several reasons. Israelis are more or less have been immune from the conflict in the past decades since the construction of the barrier in the West Bank, the withdrawal from Gaza, the sharp reduction in the number of terrorist attacks, which usually happen in the form of rocket fire from Gaza, that has nothing to do with the Kerry negotiations. And the right-wing coalition can be replaced. Netanyahu's advantage is that he holds enormous political power, and that any deal signed by Netanyahu, no matter how far-reaching or how modest, would enjoy huge support among the Israeli public. So it's really up to Netanyahu to make up his mind about that. It's not as if he's held captive by his coalition partners or even by his party members, who are more or less the majority within Likud is against any territorial concession. But this can be changed. The issue of Fatah and Hamas is less discussed because there are other issues here at play. First of all, the negotiation is more about the narrative issues, about the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state by the Palestinians, than about practical issues like the future linkage between the West Bank and Gaza or the exact delineation of the border. And narrative issues that go deep to the psyche and national ethos of both populations are very difficult to reconcile. It's by recognition of Israel as a Jewish state means that we are the owners of the land and they are the occupiers. And the right of return means that they were the owners of the land and now us, the occupiers. And how do you reconcile that? So
do you think, I mean, you've been covering this for a long time. Do you see any signs on either side that people are willing to break with their narratives in any kind of serious fashion?
No, but the debate here is, in the 90s, the idea was to put the narrative issues away and negotiate the practicalities as if there are no narrative issues. And time and again, the narrative issues came to dominate the conversation. What Bibi is trying to do is to put the narrative issues first. But so far, it doesn't get you any closer to a deal. What I believe Kerry is trying to do is to tell the Palestinians, look, it's just words. Say whatever Bibi wants you to say, and then I could get Bibi to say the word 1967, which is the dreaded word on the border issue. But I think there's another issue that's not very often discussed, and that's the Israeli perception of the Arab Spring. Because what we see in Syria, it's just across the border. It's not in Rwanda. It's not in Yugoslavia. Not in Chechnya. It's 2 hours drive from Tel Aviv. What we see there is a mass murder with the world looking the other way. Now, if you are an Israeli, you would ask yourself, even if it's not so much pronounced, you ask yourself, okay, let's say we give this territory to the Palestinians, and there is a Palestinian state, and one day the Arab world gets itself back into order, and there's war, and we're attacked. Is anybody in the world, would anybody in the world come to save us? Or are we going to face the same fate as all those Syrians who either were killed or many more just fled their homes, and millions who fled Syria and will probably never get back there?
But let me ask you this.
So that doesn't...
Do you endorse that view? Do you think that there's validity to that view? Because I don't think your newspaper does.
No, I don't necessarily agree with this view. I'm just saying that when I ask myself, how come the Israeli public is not enthusiastic about the peace process, the underlying fear, amplified by what we see in Syria, is there, although very few people talk about it or write about it.
Let me go to this for a minute, because something that you hear, and again...
But by the way, and I'll add one more thing about it, one more paragraph.
Make it a short paragraph.
And that is, President Obama was able to gain more support and admiration in Israel after his visit last year. But I think all of this evaporated when he decided not to attack Syria and to keep Assad in power. Now, that might be a very smart decision, but to Israelis it meant that there is no real stick behind America's foreign policy.
So let me posit this corollary issue to you and ask you to respond to it, because, like you, I think that the settlements are a big problem, a big obstacle to peace, and they threaten the demographic and democratic future of the state of Israel. But I hear mainstream Israeli friends of mine, centrist, people who would vote or had voted for Lapid's party as opposed to Bibi, say the following, and you hear this over and over again. In 2000, the world wanted Israel to evacuate South Lebanon, so it did. Within 6 years, Hezbollah is launching rocket attacks on Israel, forcing Israel to go to war, very devastating war. Now Hezbollah has 50 or 60,000 rockets sitting there. In 2005, Ariel Sharon decided to unilaterally withdraw, again, acceding to what the world said it wanted, withdrew settlers and soldiers from Gaza. Hamas almost immediately comes in, replaces the Israeli army, and uses Gaza as a launching pad for rockets. So you and I both know, and a lot of people in this audience know, that the worst thing you can be in Israel is a friar, is a sucker. It's very much embedded in the culture that you're not going to be fooled twice. So a lot of people say, look, we've been fooled. We've been fooled twice. Now you're saying, now John Kerry is coming to us in the course of this disintegration of the Middle East, where Syria has become a charnel house, where Egypt is unstable, where Lebanon bombs are exploding every day. And he's telling us that, oh, you know what, the next thing you have to do is leave most of the West Bank and put it in the hands of an admittedly weak power. So when I hear Israelis say this, and again, centrist Israelis, not settlers, when I hear them say it, it makes a lot of sense to me. What am I missing here?
Well, you're missing several things. First of all, the second best option after making peace and lovey-dovey relationship or strategic with your neighborhood or strategic alliance like Israel has with Jordan or Egypt or used to have with Turkey is deterrence. The war in 2006 was not the making of Hezbollah, it was the making of Ehud Olmert, who thought to strengthen his credentials as a military and security leader in order to be able to evacuate the settlements in the West Bank. When these soldiers were kidnapped and now we know were killed by Hezbollah, one smart Israeli told me, on that day, told me that the smartest thing to do is to fire the commander of the border zone and put a commission of inquiry to investigate the matter, but not go to a full-scale war that you don't know how to win. I mean, let's say Israel would still occupy a strip of 10 miles within Lebanon. What could prevent Hezbollah from amassing all these rockets on the other side?
But you're not
but then again, even today, wait.
But even the Israelis that I'm talking to are saying
but even today, Hezbollah respects the border and it imposes the ceasefire on all the other people in Lebanon who are not so pro-Israeli, like Palestinian groups and others. So far, Israel has failed to reach that status quo with Hamas. It's still shakier. But look, the question for all these people who voted for Lapid, it's stated by Lapid himself, is not whether the alternative to the present situation is, if we say yes to Kerry, we're going to become Switzerland or Norway the next day. The question is a tough decision between two situations. One in which Israel controls the territory in the West Bank, keep building settlements, but growingly is pushed away from the West, where it aspires to belong. And more Israelis feel more difficulty to be proud of their country, because wherever they go, they face questions, are you the new South Africa? And at some point, it might hurt the Israeli economy.
Aluf, answer this question, though. If Israel were to withdraw from the West Bank, how do you guarantee that what happened in Lebanon, what happened in Gaza, won't happen in the West Bank?
By deterrence. There's no way to guarantee it. How do you guarantee it in Egypt? Let's say that Egypt becomes Iran the next day. What can you do? Occupy Cairo? Look, you're not strong enough to control every situation, but how can you guarantee the integrity of Israel as a modern democracy if you rule over 2 million people without any political rights? And usually the demographic argument goes like this, that at some point there will be a Palestinian majority in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and then the Palestinians would demand the right to vote and outvote the Israelis, the Jews, to become a small Jewish community in an Arab state. But if the issue is rights, it doesn't matter if the voting right is not just the right of the majority, even if it's one person. So the issue of denying the Palestinians these rights, almost 20 years after Oslo, and after Oslo, the idea in Israel was that the occupation is over because now they have autonomy and they have their own political institutions and they have their own public services, and all we do is just controlling it from the outside. Today, Israelis realize that this was a sham because the occupation is pretty much still going on. And the settlements, you can say, okay, I'm for the occupation for military reasons, but I'm against the settlements, as you say. Your position, the settlements are bad, but keeping the army there is good. It didn't work.
It's not actually my position, by the way, but I'm in San Francisco. I want to be careful. But it's interesting because wasn't the mistake that Sharon made to pull out the settlers and the soldiers simultaneously?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think
was the withdrawal the right thing to do?
Of course. Look, to keep these settlements there at the time demanded, hundreds of people were killed, Israelis and Palestinians, just to keep Netzarim at the heart of Gaza. For what? And to some extent, and a twisted irony, Israel's relationship with Hamas is better defined and better organized than its relationship with the Palestinian Authority, because in the West Bank you have a mishmash of authorities and overlapping powers and land grabs, and the settlers are doing this and the army is doing that, and the different Palestinian security forces. In Gaza we have a border. One of the main problems, or the key problem of Israel, is the lack of recognized borders. And in Gaza, Sharon created a border. It's not the most quiet border, but hey, there are rockets fired at Israel from the Sinai every several weeks. So what, are we going to now reoccupy the Sinai to prevent it? No, we must find better way to deal with it. But there's no debate about the border in Gaza.
I want to come to this issue of legitimacy and democracy in a minute, but let me come to it through this question. Do you think that BDS, if it actually became effective, because we know now that it has symbolic importance, but
has a huge PR impact.
If it had actual economic impact, you and I both know the Prime Minister well. He is skilled at managing his economy, very cognizant of the strength of his economy. If that were to happen, could it, this is almost like a verboten question to ask in a way, but could it actually work to change the minds of, okay, maybe not the most extreme settlers, but could it change the minds of center-right people in Israel, including the Prime Minister, who says, okay, enough's enough. If it's between settlements and maintaining a strong economy, then we've got to go with the economy.
The short answer is yes, and the longer answer is that it's not just about the economy. It goes beyond the economy.
But that would be what would motivate Netanyahu, no?
No, but it goes beyond the economy because Netanyahu and Ehud Barak and most Israeli leaders and most mainstream Israelis see themselves as part of the West. And usually when any comparison about anything is done in the Israeli media, it's about in the Western countries, including Israel. And if Israel were to face a situation in which the West would tell it, you're not part of us anymore, that would resonate very strongly on the mindset of these mainstream center-right Israelis, including the Prime Minister. And moreover, this Prime Minister has a very obvious modus operandi in terms of decision-making. He must be pushed to a corner. And when, for example, when he decided to sign up to the Kerry talks, one of the justifications he made was that it was right after the European settlement sanctions. So he used that European sanctions, which obviously opposed, and he calls it anti-Semitic and so on. But he used that to tell is political base. Hey, we must join these talks, otherwise, see, they're going to destroy us.
So, Aluf, you believe that the settlements and the continued occupation of the West Bank pose an existential threat to Israel long term, the demographics and the question of democracy. You believe that the prime minister would be susceptible to BDS pressure. Do you support BDS?
No, I don't support BDS.
Why?
Why I don't support it?
Well, I mean, if you believe that Israel must leave the West Bank, there must be a Palestinian state in order for Israel to survive, and if you believe that that would be an effective way of convincing the prime minister to make real moves in that direction, why then?
I don't support the BDS, and I don't support a third intifada, which could also lead to that outcome as much as the second intifada threw Israel out of Gaza, and the first one forced Israel to accept the PLO.
Why don't you support?
And I don't.
Third intifada is out of your hands, but BDS is not entirely out of your hands.
No, it's not in my. It's not about being in my hands or not in my hands. I don't support the BDS because I want Israel to prosper, and to be proud of its democracy, and I don't want it to be a pariah, and I don't want to push it there.
Then how is Israel going to get then to the place that you want it to be?
Well, by making the right decisions. You know, if Israel, the best counteroffensive to BDS is not calling it anti-Semitic. This will get you only so far. The best response to BDS is to negotiate genuinely with the Palestinians over the statehood, and taking the risk that this is not going to be the most peaceful friend, but. That's the right way to counter BDS.
Stay on this for a minute, because you know the prime minister very well. He's by far the most powerful politician in Israel. There's no one behind him who can conceivably fill the role right now. What does he want?
It's the toughest question.
That's why I'm asking.
And I'm not sure that he knows, because he's now at the stage when you hear conflicting messages from him. On one hand, and then again, there's been a development there. In 2009, when 10 days after the Obama Cairo address, Netanyahu responded with a Bar Ilan speech in which he said, for the first time he uttered the words Palestinian state as a good thing. This was an earthquake. But then the next day, nothing happened. And it was quicksand. More recently, he returned to this theme, but he added a new component. He said that Israel should do anything to avoid becoming a binational state and to avoid ruling over 2 million unwilling people. So this he says one day, and the next day he says, he or his lieutenants and his mouthpieces are saying that Abu Mazen is the worst anti-Semite since I don't know whom, and that the Palestinian incitement is the worst ever, and that you can't trust the Palestinians. So I believe he's genuinely torn between this accumulation of pressure from the outside, of public opinion that might, the wind might change overnight, and people will get angry at his foot dragging. And you cannot just pin your entire foreign policy on the hope that for the third time the Palestinians will reject whatever peace plan is proposed, and throw the blame at the Palestinians and go on business as usual.
Talk about the Israeli polity a little bit, because that's what sits behind this. You and I both know that the Israel we knew 30 years ago doesn't exist in the same way. We've seen the rise of the religious nationalist movement, exemplified by the settlers. The Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population, grows. The million or so Russians who came in the last 20, 25 years.
The Arab political voice that wasn't heard at all at the time.
I want to stay, no, absolutely. That's a separate category, because that's pulling Israel in another direction. But I'm talking about there are forces that are pulling Israel ever more toward the right. Your tribe, the Tel Aviv tribe, the people who read Haaretz, it's the tribe that the Jews of San Francisco and New York and Washington can relate to maybe most easily, the non-Orthodox population at least. But it seems to be a diminishing force in Israel. Is this inexorable Is there some huge constituency for peace that we don't fully see?
Well, first of all, it's not just the issue of numbers, and constituency for peace, even in the past, was never when peace happened or when Israel withdrew from territory. Not only when by agreement, it was mostly done when the center-right accepted it as a better policy, and the center-right accepted Oslo, however reluctantly, but it accepted Oslo. The center-right withdrew from Gaza. The activist left withdrew from Lebanon. Begin withdrew from the Sinai. So I don't think it's a kind of, if you look at the demographics and say, okay, if there's only a certain number of secular people who have smaller families than the religious people, then there can be no change. What has changed in Israel is tribalism, which I think was I was asking myself, our national singer, Arik Einstein, died 3 months ago. And recently I asked myself, could there be another Arik Einstein? And the answer was no, because Arik Einstein was possible because when he was the king of Israeli popular culture, there was only one single television channel and 2.5 radio channels. Today you can live in your separate ultra-Orthodox or Arab or national religious or Tel Aviv community and be totally, or Russian community, and be totally ignorant of the other subcultures in Israel. There's very little conversation going on between these tribes. And it has economic effects because of the underemployment of Arabs and ultra-Orthodox. The issue of Haredi draft is now a very big issue once again in Israel. But I don't think it has to do with constituency for peace, because the ultra-Orthodox are not necessarily right-wingers who are very strong nationalists. They don't sing the anthem. They would support a deal if it's good for them. The Arab population that has yet to join any governing coalition in Israel, if there is agreement with the Palestinians, and Netanyahu and other prime ministers pledged that if there is such an agreement, it would be brought to a referendum. This would give the Arab population enormous political power, because of the disagreement within the Jewish community in Israel, the Arab vote might tilt the referendum either way. So if you want to make controversial decisions, you need to put together a coalition. But for example, in the current Knesset, if the right wing, if Bennett and the Jewish Home leaves the coalition, the Labor and the ultra-Orthodox can come in. So Bibi has a coalition for peace. And I believe that if Bibi, as I said, if Bibi brings any deal to the table, he would win the national referendum.
John Kerry has suggested pretty strongly that this is the last chance for Israel to come to some sort of equitable two-state solution. Is that just hype in order to get things moving, or is he onto something?
Well, we've heard it many times before. It's always the last chance. It was the last chance at Camp David, and it was the last chance at Annapolis, and it was the last chance, I don't know, in Rhodos in 1949. What does it mean if it fails? Look, if it fails and there are new circumstances next year or the year after that, it can happen. Look, what are we talking about here? If we're trying to implement the Olmert plan, which was to some extent a small extension of the Barak plan at Camp David in 2000. If we want to implement it, and we need to evacuate 100,000 settlers. Look, Israel absorbed, only recently, 1 million people from the former Soviet Union with no jobs and no housing. It can absorb 100,000 people, most of whom work within the Green Line anyway. I mean, it's not beyond Israel's capability. Israel always has the option, even without peace, Israel always has the option to say goodbye and leave.
And yet it's been almost 50 years, and there's been no impulse to say goodbye.
Because the status quo has been so far, even despite the two intifadas, At the end of the day, the status quo was more convenient. The enemy of peace today is not war, or the opposite of peace is not war, it's the status quo. And by the way, we have the control group, we have the Syria agreement, which was, as you know, it was almost here. It was just for Barak or the Rabin before him just to sign. And it never happened. And today, obviously, there are second thoughts that, given what's happening in Syria, that keeping the Golan is better. And I think this position enjoys global support.
Right.
There's no push for Israel to leave the Golan.
I want to change subjects a little bit and talk about American Jewry. But I want to hear what you have to say on this subject from an Israeli perspective. I mean, we in the American Jewish community spend a lot of evenings like this. Hundreds of people gather and talk about Israel and its future and its troubles and its meaning and its conflicts. In Israel, there are very few halls that are filled every night with Israeli Jews talking about the future of American Jewry. What's going to happen to them? I'm worried about them. I don't know what to do with them. They embarrass me. I'm so proud of them.
It's a very good topic. Why? Because we have Haaretz in Hebrew and in English, and there are stories that work well in both languages. There's one story that doesn't travel, and it's the Women of the Wall, which is always a hit with our American readers, and the dullest story for our Hebrew readers, because if you're a secular in Israel, why bother to pray anywhere? And if you wanted to pray in Tel Aviv, why go to the Kotel to Jerusalem? And I think it shows,
But there's also an Israeli, even among secular Israelis, a distaste for, or a lack of experience with new modes of Jewish worship and behavior. There's Orthodox or nothing, and most people choose nothing.
Exactly. So I think that the gap here is not between Israeli Orthodox, or the guy from Bnei Brak or Mea Shearim and his cousin from Brooklyn. They don't have any disagreement or any difference between them. It's just different addresses. To the Tel Aviv seculars, when we see our American Jewish peers, they look the same to us, and we all share the same culture, and we all watch the same TV shows, and so on. But the religious component is much stronger to you guys because it's a much more important part of your identity. In Israel, you can be a very good Jew just by speaking Hebrew and going to the army and just by being there and celebrate the holidays. And I don't think we pay enough attention as Israeli Jews to what's happening to our American cousins.
What do you think is happening to the American cousins vis-a-vis Israel specifically, and then broaden it out and talk about what's happening in this community?
I don't know enough to say anything about the religious or spiritual life of American Jews. Regarding Israel, I think that we hear more about Israel. I mean, there's always this threat, again, just like the threat of the last chance for peace, there's always the threat that, the new generation of American Jews is simply going to turn away from Israel and forget all about it, and it would be just like any other country in the world. And those who say that, at the same time, are obsessively dealing with how you should discuss Israel in America and what should be the extent of the debate about Israel in America and are we for or against BDS and so on. So I think that Israel is pretty much on the mind of all those Jews who are involved with their Judaism. And I think that the number of American Jews visiting Israel obviously multiplied by orders of magnitude since the beginning of Birthright. There's a growing community of young American expats living in Tel Aviv, going to grad schools in Israel, or simply coming to live and work in Israel. And I think the economic crisis here contributed to that. Now, these people, not all of them stay in Israel, but just like your experience, when you come back here, you still have this knack for Israeli things. There's a community like that in Moscow now, of people who came, Jews who came, made Aliyah, lived in Israel for a few years, a decade or so, and then moved back to Moscow. And they have their own sub-Russian-Israeli culture in there. And one of the things we're trying to do at Haaretz is to strengthen these ties. I mean, when we hired Peter Beinart to write a weekly column for us, clearly it was aimed at our readers in English, but I argued that we must translate it into Hebrew and give it prominent play in the Hebrew paper, because it's a window for us to read about American Jews from an American Jewish genuine perspective.
Do you think Peter Beinart is right that young American Jews are fleeing identification with Israel out of embarrassment at Israel's policies?
I don't know. I mean, he makes a very powerful and convincing case, but you know, I never lived among American Jews to know it, and those American Jews I meet, like all of you in the audience here, are obviously interested and involved with Israel. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here.
They're here for the snacks, actually.
So, you know,
yeah. They're not really here. Yeah.
You know, occasionally you meet people who tell you that they don't care. Right. But the basic argument, you know, it goes back 4 or 5 years. The basic argument was, you know, we elected Obama, you elected Netanyahu and Lieberman, and we can't identify with that. And guess what happened? Not the American Jewish voice has changed. Lieberman has changed. Lieberman, which was under the previous Israeli government, in the same role as foreign minister, was the epitome of whatever is wrong with Israeli policies, and the worst, the one kind of politician you could never identify with. Now he's the most ardent supporter of Kerry in the Israeli government. He's the only one saying publicly that Kerry is a great friend of Israel and that the Kerry proposal is the best deal we can get, even in the future. So, you know, these things fluctuate. I don't think there's one way of, you know, American Jews turning away from Israel, and that's that.
We're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes or so, but
let me ask you.
Yeah.
Do you feel that younger American Jews are distancing themselves from Israel? Those who are in colleges and grad schools.
Look, I'm just old enough that I have pre-Intifada, first Intifada memories of Israel. I mean, the formative Israeli experience of my youth was the raid on Entebbe, and I think for people slightly older than I am, it was the Six-Day War. It was unadulterated pride, Jewish warriors going out. I mean, what is a simpler, more noble narrative than the raid on Entebbe? Which, you know, I bring this up for a very specific reason, because I know the Entebbe story cold. Everybody my age knows it absolutely cold. You know, Jews were hijacked by Arabs and Germans, to make it even more sort of Baroque, flown into Uganda.
A French plane.
On a French plane. But to be fair to the French crew, they stayed with the Jews.
I know.
They learned something. They evolved. And then, you know, these heroic warrior Jews of a type we hadn't seen for 2,000 years flew in the middle of the night, including the prime minister's brother, who didn't come back, and rescued them. And that was an amazing narrative. I bring this up because I was talking to a J Street group recently, and I was talking about my formative experiences with Israel, and they didn't know the story of Entebbe. What they know mainly, if you're a J Street and you're a university or just 25 or 26 or 28, you don't even know the first Intifada, which is sort of the mild Intifada. You know the second Intifada, and you sort of know the really polarized narratives, and you experienced college with a prime minister of Israel. You've lived through your college years with a prime minister of Israel who does not seem like you. Most young American Jews vote Democratic. They were huge supporters of Obama. Netanyahu strikes them as a Republican. So there's a very, you know, that being said, I think that the demise of the relationship is probably exaggerated, and if it is slipping, it has more to do with, this is where one of the areas I disagree with Peter Beinart. Beinart says that a lot of young American Jews are embarrassed by Israeli behavior. It doesn't conform to their own liberal notions of what the world should look like, and therefore they leave Israel. But I actually think what comes first is disaffection or disengagement from Judaism, from the broader aspects of Jewish life in America. If you don't have a strong Jewish identity, you're not going to necessarily identify strongly with Israel.
But the paradox here is that if you're making J Street disproves the case, because if they were turning away,
they wouldn't join.
Why do they need J Street? They could just be Americans, voting for Obama, and that's it.
One of the real utilities of J Street is that it's kind of like a catch basin in a way for young Jews, especially young Jews, who look at the Israeli policies on the West Bank and don't like them, but don't want to leave that connection to Israel behind.
Because you can't be in J Street and just don't think about Israel.
Right. But the question is, can the status quo hold? I mean, how long? And this is I've brought this up in front of J Street audiences. So after another 5 or 10 years, if there's no progress made toward disentangling Israel from the lives of Palestinians who do not wish to be occupied by Israel, if no progress is made, when do those people in J Street say, you know what, enough already, this is not a country I can relate to in any way, and I'm going to move to some other place, either disaffection or just becoming anti-Israel? I mean, this is the question.
Anti-Israel is also involved.
Anti-Israel is,
it's not ignorant. I think
well, it's ignorant, but whatever. We'll get it.
There are other issues at play. For example, the rise of the power of the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, and the troubles they're making to young Reform Jews who are trying to make Aliyah.
Just tell them I'll call them back.
About their Jewishness. Yeah. And this is also a very important issue. We are the only ones in Israel who even report about it.
Right.
So let me end. It's a kind of way where Israel is distancing itself from American Jews.
Right. Right. No, women of the wall for Israelis, for the Israeli government, is a security issue as much as it's anything else. It's a volatile part of Jerusalem. You don't want to have, for American Jews, especially American women and men who support the idea of egalitarian Judaism, which is most American Jewish men. That's an issue of, wait, this is our holy land, but you won't let me wear a tallis without getting arrested at our holiest site. So go back to them, and then we'll go to questions. But this is the question: how long? And this is a broad question, I think. How long can the status quo hold before things start to break apart? I mean, it's been 47 years. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War in this decade. 40 years of settlement. I mean, at what point do things start to sort of break apart? Or maybe they've already started to break apart and we don't fully realize that.
I think that in the past year, for many years, the word occupation was not so much used in the context of Israeli-Palestinian relations in the mainstream. It was as if, there's a relationship between Israel and Palestinian political or military entities like Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. And the issue of occupation came back to the fore in the past year. Like, we haven't heard about that kind of discussion was not spoken, I think, since before the first Intifada. It takes me back to the 70s, to the beginnings of peace now in Israel. And part of that comes from the enormous success of Bennett and the Jewish Home in the election, after which senior Israeli politicians started once again to boast about the settlements. For many years, Israel built like crazy in the settlements, but it wasn't discussed. For example, when the Olmert government retired, they published a book about all the achievements they had in 3 years and everything they did, and there was a huge chapter devoted to housing. Not one word about even one tiny apartment, one roof built in the West Bank, although under Olmert, thousands of new houses were built there. But the new Likud government, and unlike the previous one, this government, every day they're boasting about more settlements and more subsidies to settlements and more budget allocations to settlements. And that created a huge reaction. So the word occupation came back to haunt us. So I think that when you ask when this occupation policy will break apart, we know from history that these changes are usually very rapid. The status quo holds and then it changes overnight. and then there's a new status quo, and which takes a long time to change. So I can't give you the exact expiry date of the status quo, but I think it's getting there. And now you can ask yourself, and the Israeli political situation contributes to that because nobody sees an alternative to Netanyahu. There is no left-wing leader who, you think if we supported this or that leader, Tzipi Livni or Bougie Herzog or someone like that, everything would change. No, it's Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is there to stay for the time being. And apparently, this tough decision might fall on his lap.
So we're going to go to questions. I guess there's a couple of mics. So if you raise your, we can't see that well from up here.
Since we have such a full house, we're going to ask you all to come to the aisles. There'll be another mic on the other side, and we're going to alternate. And I would just like to remind everybody to try to keep their questions to one question. And also to remind
do more than try.
to keep it to one question.
Succeed.
To succeed. And also to ask you all, we know that there are passions that run high with this subject, to please be respectful of the JCC and our invited guests and to the audience with your questions. Thanks.
And if you're throwing things, throw them that way. That's what I think.
So
that's
come to the aisles if you have a question. If you can't come to the aisles, we'll come to you. Thanks. Okay, we're going to start right here on this side.
Could you comment on two recent events? Number one, Ari Shavit on his book tour mentioned repeatedly that settlements aren't the issue. It's really the acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state. And just yesterday, your colleague editors at Haaretz came out and expressed about their interview with Yasser Arafat and his comment that, of course, Israel is a Jewish state.
So what's the question? Was Arafat right? Look, obviously, the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Jewish-Palestinian conflict began way before the settlements. You don't need Ari Shavit's book. Ari is a good friend and an old colleague, and he wrote a very powerful and magnificent book. But you don't need to read Ari's book to know that there was this conflict going on from before. And as you know, the issue of acceptance goes both ways. Is there acceptance of a Palestinian right to have an independent Palestinian state? Not, many Israelis in the right wing, for example, argue that there is no such right. There was never a separate Palestinian people. That is just an invention that was made as part of the conflict. And, we don't need to go through the old Asbara arguments. They have 22 countries, we have only one, and so on and so forth. And yes, the issue of acceptance, what I call the narrative issues, this is the toughest issue, and it goes both ways. And the question is, could you find a workable solution around it? I don't believe that we could convince the Palestinians that the Jewish people was in Palestine before them and that they came afterwards, or that we can convince the Israeli Jews that they're just a bunch of colonialists who found an easy prey in Palestine. I don't think so, and there must, if we want to reach peace, if we want to reach a workable solution, we must find a way around the narrative issues. The idea that, because even if, let's say, Abu Mazen says to Kerry, you know what, you're right. I recognize Israel not only as a Jewish state, but as a state of the Jewish people, meaning that anyone Jewish anywhere in the world has the right to be there, and more than the Palestinian refugee who will never return to her or his ancestral home in Jaffa and Haifa. So what? So Abbas says that. Does it erase the Palestinian national ethos overnight? Will all Palestinians afterwards say, okay, Israel is a Jewish state, and come on, it's the heart of the problem, but the way to solve it is not through just chanting some magic words that will resolve the conflict the next morning. It's not going to work.
Next question.
Thank you. I have a question concerning the boycott. Something awful happened in the last few years, and I want to refer to the fact that in 2009-10, Israel was admitted to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, for which Stanley Fischer, fought. And at that time, Israel was rejected as a member of EU, and despite all the barriers which were positioned by companies and all kinds of interests, it was admitted, and it was a great opportunity to show that Israel was a startup nation, as Netanyahu himself often mentions, and the book was produced, and it was the most industrialized, most innovative country. And somehow, what happened in the meantime, that momentum has been lost, that the boycott was allowed to go on, and forgetting about all these virtues that...
Well, I don't think it's forgetting. As I mentioned before, only in the past week there were two major deals of Israeli startup companies being bought by, one by a Japanese company and the other by Google. I don't think that this was forgotten. What I think, well, the funny thing about Israel's admission to the OECD was that to be admitted, you need a consensus of the pre-existing members. And Turkey was then at its worst crisis with Israel, and they tried to block its admission into the OECD. They were there before. So the Americans went to Erdogan and told him, the country which presented Israel as nomination to the OECD was Turkey, under your government, Mr. Erdogan. So they withdrew their opposition, and Israel was accepted into the OECD. Now, I don't think there's any debate about Israel's economic development, and the boycott movement is not arguing that Israel is not developed. It's trying to trim that development, or even use it as a leverage to convince Israelis to change their policies. I think that what really happened was that the Europeans, who for many years felt that they are sidelined by the Americans and by the Israelis when they want to intervene and be part of the peace process, found a way to push themselves into the peace process and into influence over Israeli policy through the threat of sanctions. And the key person in this process has been the rising leader of Europe, which is Angela Merkel, whose government, on one hand, supplies Israel with the most sophisticated item in the Israeli arsenal, which is submarines. And at the same time, she had fierce conversations with Netanyahu over the settlement issue. And when Germany is cooling off its support for Israel, clearly the smaller European countries, who have been traditionally more supportive of the Palestinian cause, have more leverage. And I think that's the key change, because when American academic associations declare their boycott of Israel, it's more symbolic. When the EU conditions any cooperation with Israel with delineating the green line, the 67 line, as the border of this cooperation, that's a huge change.
Can I just let me make a couple of quick points on that. The first is, let's not overstate the influence or damage that the boycott movement has done to Israel. You mentioned a couple of deals that were made. People don't realize this, but the largest private employer in Israel is Intel. Every high-tech company...
And the largest exporter.
And the largest exporter. Every high-tech company has R&D facilities, manufacturing facilities. Israel's economy is, by most standards, booming. And the global high-tech industry is so integrated into Israel that it can't leave Israel. If one day Intel announced that it was leaving Israel, well, that would be game over. Netanyahu would have to do whatever Intel wanted. He doesn't have to listen to Kerry as much as he has to listen to Intel. So let's not. I don't want to overstate things. And the other thing is that you have to disaggregate different components of the BDS movement. What you're talking about with EU boycott, those are not boycotts in the, there's a very hardcore anti-Israel, people who are opposed to the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, who are calling for boycott of anything made in Israel, academics who come from Israel. That's not what we're talking about with the EU. The EU is talking about a very specific issue of you've got to certify that these products are not made or grown in settlements on the West Bank. Nobody in Europe is not buying Israeli-made goods.
I agree, but since the current Israeli government is very supportive of the settlements, to them, any sanction of the settlements, they say this is anti-Semitism, and this equates the BDS, the worst BDS detractors of Israel.
And by the way, one final short point on that is that much of the time it is anti-Semitism, and we have to focus on that as well. You don't have to support the settlements to recognize that the BDS movement, because of the double standard that it applies alone, has manifestations of anti-Semitism. This is a movement, after all, that does not care what happens in China, does not care about what happens in Iran, does not care about what happens in any kind of despotic regime across the world. This is a movement that's devoted to the isolation and scapegoating of a country that happens to be the world's only Jewish country. So let's not, I don't want to downplay the pernicious quality of this, and it goes to a point about Israel's ability and limitations in dealing with it. Israel's a small country. It is the only Jewish country. It always will be on the defensive against much larger movements that are devoted to doing it ill, and which comes back to a point about Israel making smart policy decisions based on reality. And one of the realities that Israel has to deal with in the coming days, in coming months and years, is that the world is growing less tolerant of the settlement movement. There are people who hate Israel, no matter what Israel does. The only thing that Israel could do to make them happy would be to commit mass suicide. But you have to put those in one category, and you have to put a larger group in another category. But anyway, go over here. Yeah.
Next question on this side.
Oh, you want to hold it? So we comment and we discuss the motivation that Israelis and American Jews have about acceptance of a two-state solution, what we're willing to do, what we're not willing to do. But we don't talk much about the Palestinian side. And what I was wondering is, do they really have a motivation to make a two-state solution succeed? I mean, if indeed this is the last chance, and what's down the road is a binational state, isn't that the Holy Grail?
Well, there is an argument that made most recently by Shlomo Avineri, who's one of Israel's most prominent political scientists, that the Palestinian strategy, and in particular Mahmoud Abbas's strategy, has been to pocket Israeli concessions and never to sign anything, and just push Israel further and further and further towards this binational state. But the Palestinian national movement, the first Intifada was really a choice between a binational state and take it independence. Because before the first Intifada, and to all those of us who lived through Israel of the 70s and 80s, the binational state was there. There were no internal borders. There were no checkpoints. You could go. I remember taking the family car with my brother, driving to Ramallah and Jericho, just to eat hummus or just to tour. Israelis used to go to dentists in Kalkilia and to fix their cars with Jenin mechanics. And the entire service sector in Israel at the time was manned by Palestinians. We didn't even call them Palestinians. We called them Arabs from the territories. Now you can make the case that if at that point those Palestinians who worked in Israel, who received some Israeli social security benefits, some of them worked for the same employers or were partners in businesses for a long time. If at that time those people would have said, you know what, it's one state anyway, just give us the vote. We want to be good Israelis. But they chose the opposite. They rebelled, and they created a situation that would be very difficult to turn backwards. And what happened in the Israeli public discourse is that the Israeli political spectrum is not linear, it's circular. Because we have both the far right-wingers and the far left-wingers support one state. We have right-wingers like Moshe Arens and Ruby Rivlin argue for one state for liberal reasons and are against partition. And still I think that what would have been a better situation, to have Gazans working in Tel Aviv or to have Gaza separate from Israel as it is now? And that's why I don't think that the one state is a serious option. But it's gaining more traction because of the counter-reaction to the renewed boasting about settlement growth is the binational / one state, one democratic state. But I don't really see it coming. And I believe that once again, can the Palestinians be pushed into a deal with Israel? I hope. But let's say Israel says, okay, we can't negotiate, like Sharon did. We can't negotiate. As of January 1st, 2000, whatever, we're leaving the West Bank to the Green Line plus settlement blocks plus East Jerusalem, and simply leaves. What happens then? The Palestinian leadership would say, no, stay with us and just give us the vote, and we want Fatah to be a party in the Knesset, and we're going to sing a tikva and swear by the Israeli flag, just stay with us? Or are they going to try and put together some workable government, as they did in Gaza? And I think it would be the latter rather than the former.
Next question.
So a question about the settlement issue again. With the memory of the Gaza settlements and withdrawing them and the trauma of that in mind, could you envision a scenario in which the settlements in the West Bank could somehow be left behind the boundary and become part of the Palestinian state? And those Jews that wish to stay on there would be Jews living in Palestine, which wouldn't be such a bad thing. I mean, obviously, Palestine would be on the world stage and would have to treat those Jews in such a way that they wouldn't garner bad public opinion. But it seems to me that, with the expanding settlements the way that they are, it's becoming harder and harder to hold off criticism of the rest of the world.
I'll let Aluf deal with the politics of that, but the supposition you just made that an ethnic or religious minority will be treated well in an Arab Sunni Muslim majority state is not borne out by reality in Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Sudan, really anywhere across Turkey. I mean, this is not a merciful region, and we see it over and over again, whether it's Copts, Christians, Kurds, blacks in Sudan. There's no mercy for the weak. There's no mercy for minority populations. So I would not make the assumption that Palestine would be, milk and honey for Jews who are there. In any case, and Aluf can handle this part, the Palestinian Authority said no Jews. So.
I don't think it's a serious proposition. No, there's a very small group of people led by the late Rabbi Menachem Froman of Tkoa, who genuinely believe that it's better to be part of a Jewish minority in Palestine and deal with the conflict through in a spiritual way rather than through guns and using force. This group of people might stay in a Palestinian state, but I don't see the settlers of Yitzhar with their mistreatment of their neighbors becoming nice, supportive citizens of Palestine, singing Biladi Biladi and saluting the Palestinian flag overnight and forgetting what Rabbi Cook told them about the need to be the lords of the land and so on. So I think it's a kind of placebo, trying to say, well, it's not going to be so bad, it's just about moving the border, you could stay. I don't think this will happen.
Next question on this side.
Yeah, I want to address a little bit of the question that Jeffrey brought up about young American Jews and the relationship of Jews to Israel, particularly about, just to try to focus briefly, I mean, one is just people vote with their feet, and you can look at the demographic in the audience. The younger demographic didn't, as you said, grow up with Entebbe, but a more troubled image of Israel, more complex, subtle, and troubled image. And so you do have J Street, which is a little bit of a backstop, but now you have, on the edge, you have these discussions in Hillels about whether you can even talk about BDS or not, or have discussions about BDS. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to address your thoughts about the acceptability of even discussing the issue in the Jewish community in an open way, or having those discussions.
Can I add something to it? You said that the formative experience for your generation of American Jews regarding Israel was Entebbe, and before that the Six-Day War. Magnificent military, heroic victories. We know that since then, there were very few military victories of Israel to be proud of. Can there be identification of Israel with Israel that is not based on the military? Could the startup nation become the alternative to worshipping Dayan and Arik Sharon?
No. This is very interesting. I mean, we were talking about this before.
I never thought about it before.
No. We were talking about this just before. And we have, in the American Jewish community, we have this kind of ridiculously telescoped, narrow understanding of what Israel is. And it's like, Israel is popular if we happen to like the prime minister, and it's unpopular if we don't like the prime minister. I mean, this goes to sort of Mordechai Kaplan Jewish civilization questions, but Israel is, half the world's Jews are in Israel. It had revitalized the Jewish language. It is the repository of Jewish culture and music, and it's a scientific hub, a medical hub, agriculture. We have this very, very narrow, pinched relationship with the idea of Israel. We've politicized it to the point where all we talk about is settlements. We should talk about settlements, but we have this kind of crazy, so everybody's litmus test is, I don't like Israel because of X, or I like Israel because of Y, but they don't have a normal human variegated experience with their Israeli cousins, essentially, their brothers and sisters, who happen to, many of them came from the same ghetto 3 generations ago. One went this way, the other went that way. But it's a broader point. I'll let you come to this if you want. Or I have this. We were just, again, talking about this before. I tend to think that there's a little bit of this martyrdom complex going on in certain Jewish circles in America. It's like, oh, we can't talk about this or they'll punish us. It's like nobody's cutting off cartoonists' heads for saying things. I mean, the classic Jewish communal reaction to people who say things that they don't like is to whine at them. I mean, it's not, we're not, there's no brutality here. That said, so any Jew in America can say, I hate Israel, and they can form an organization called IHateIsrael.com, and they could get as many members as they can, and they could publish books, and they could have rallies. I mean, nobody's stopping anyone. I mean, the question for Hillel, I think, and I've talked to a lot of people in Hillel about this, is Hillel is an organization devoted to the advancement of Judaism and world Jewry. Half of the Jews live in Israel, so they support the existence of a Jewish state. Most of the rest of the world's Jews support the existence of a Jewish state. If you want to come into a Hillel and say, I oppose to the existence of a Jewish state, well, then you're really running counter some basic programming. It's like coming into Hillel and saying, I'd like to have Christian worship on Friday night at Hillel at a certain point. It's on the same continuum. Maybe it's not so ridiculous as that, but it's sort of on the same continuum. So I understand the people at Hillel who say, you know what? You want to be on campus and you want to advocate against Israel's existence. The First Amendment covers your right, but for reasons of adhering to what the vast majority of American Jews believe, we're not going to host you and your organization in our building. And also, like, at a certain point, it becomes an issue of self-respect. You know what I mean? I mean, no one expects, an NAACP chapter to host a KKK speaker in the interest of free speech. So why would you bring in? No, I mean, and by the way, this covers. I wouldn't have Kahanists, in Hillel for the same reason, because they don't endorse fascism. So why would you go that direction either? I mean, each organization should be allowed the right of a free assembly. You're allowed to do what you want within your organization, and if you don't like it, form another organization. That said, there are lines that some Jewish organizations have drawn that seem to me too severe. When you talk about peace now, Shalom Akshav, peace now, or J Street or whatever, and they say, well, they shouldn't be part of the broader Jewish community. It's like, as long as you baseline say that, Israel is a legitimate member state of the United Nations and is a homeland for the Jews. What you want to do with that homeland, that's fine. But I don't find myself particularly sympathetic to the whole open Hillel, the so-called open Hillel idea. Aluf, you want to get into that one?
No.
No.
I've never been a part of Hillel.
We have time for one more question.
There was an article written in the New York Review of Books, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who wrote it, a few months ago. And he was decrying the lack of cultural and educational contacts between Israelis and Palestinians in recent years. And he went so far as to say that when American politicians even when they go to meet Chabad, it's so restricted. They don't get to talk to Palestinians. It's armored cars. It's have a meeting and back to Tel Aviv. And you were mentioning yourself what it was like for you in the 70s and 80s. Is it true that those cultural groups have been prevented or disbanded? And what are your own contacts with Palestinians like these days?
There is virtually zero contact between Israeli Jews and Palestinians in the West. I mean, Gaza is totally sealed, and but in the West Bank, where you don't have a border, you can go there, but there is virtually no contact between Israelis and Palestinians. The intifadas, the withdrawal from Gaza, the barrier in the West Bank, the withdrawal of the Palestinians from the Israeli job market created a situation that to Israelis like my daughter, who's going to turn 26 next week, who was born right at the beginning of the first Intifada, she saw Palestinians only on TV. She did a military service not in the territories. So the only Palestinians she ever saw were people like Abbas on television. And I believe this is true in a different way to the same generation of Palestinians. They can see Israelis in settlements, but they don't really, unless they work there, and this is relatively a very small number of people, they don't actually interact with them. And this was very different 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, where you could feel these people. And I recall that New York Review article, but they come with armored cars to Israel as well, and these American diplomats, and they barely visit Tel Aviv either. But look, they're coming there not to be immersed in the Hebrew and our Palestinian culture. They come to be diplomats and play diplomacy. So I think the argument was different. The argument was that American Jewish leaders have no interaction with the Palestinians, not American officials. But interestingly, even during the worst days of the Second Intifada and the suicide bombing campaign, the only ones who were still traveling between Ramallah and Jerusalem were American Jewish groups.
Right.
And they still maintained their contacts with the Palestinians, even when the Israeli government shunned them. But the isolation of the two societies is an issue. I don't know if it's, you can argue that it's good or bad, but it's an issue. And the Israeli Arab community serve as a sort of bridge between Israeli Jews and the Palestinians, and between Israeli Jews and the wider Arab world. Because today, because of Al Jazeera and other satellite TV options, the younger generation of Israeli Arab youth has less motivation to learn Hebrew and to succeed or to immerse itself in the Jewish culture because they can go to college in Jordan. Many of the families, they take their holidays in Jordan, and they can watch TV just like their peers in Syria or in Lebanon or in Egypt or elsewhere. And at the same time, I sense some more interest among Israeli liberals in Middle Eastern culture, in music produced in Lebanon and so on, or film, but actual interaction between people's zero.
Just a quick point on that. This is one of the sort of weirdnesses of the Middle East, that the Israelis who have the most day-to-day contact with Palestinians in the West Bank are settlers. And it's not just in the usual way that you would think, checkpoints or whatever. But I mean, like, you look at the SodaStream controversy. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating because you had Palestinian West Bank Arab supervisors in the SodaStream company who supervised Jewish workers, arguing for the maintenance of maintaining this plant in the West Bank. I mean, that's a whole other separate issue.
And settlers and security service people who are also immersed themselves in Arabic and in the Palestinian culture. And when you I don't know, many of you watch The Gatekeepers. But the gatekeepers, beside the politics, these people spend their lives interacting with Palestinians, even if it was many times in interrogations and not in a very equal relationship. Still, they had to teach themselves the language, the culture, the composition of Palestinian society. And as you saw, when they came out of office, they all became the most ardent supporters of withdrawal and ending the occupation.
Well, to go directly to this point, it is a tragedy that there's not more contact, because I really believe that just as Palestinians who actually meet Jewish Israelis begin to get a more complicated understanding of what they're dealing with, I really do believe that Jews, Israeli Jews, American Jews, whoever it is, who goes to the West Bank, go to the West Bank and meet Palestinians in their field or in other fields, the belief that there's no Palestinian who'd be willing to make an equitable two-state solution with Israel, that belief cannot survive contact with many Palestinians who I know. I mean, and the shutting down of those contacts is not healthy for the peace process at all.
I want to thank everybody for coming and thank our guests.
Thank you.